Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Drejcik. I am the administrator of the Ukrainian Studies program here at the Harriman Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today. We have a hybrid event, so we have a live audience as well as a virtual audience. Our event is also going to be broadcast on Zoom and on YouTube, and it'll be recorded later for viewing on YouTube. Our talk is entitled Wellsprings of David Bolyuk's Art, Exploring His Enduring Inspiration from Kakhovka to New York. And our presenter is Miroslav Shkandriy. I will introduce him shortly. But first, I have a brief note about two more events we have as the semester winds down here at Columbia University. December 8th, which is next Wednesday, we have a Ukrainian Film Club event that was rescheduled. It's entitled Ukrainian Film Club, Young Ukrainian Filmmakers on What It Means to Be Ukrainian Today. It's at 7 p.m. next Wednesday, December 8th. It's an in-person event. You have to go to our website to read about how to register to attend, and it's for CUID card holders only. And then the following day, on December 9th at noon, we will be having a hybrid event like today's here in 1219 for those that can attend in person, but it'll also be, of course, on Zoom and on YouTube. The topic next Thursday is Memory Battles and Ukrainian Contemporary Art. Our speaker is Katerina Yakovlenko, and our discussant then is Olena Martinyuk, and I will be moderating that talk, so we invite you also to come to that event. And Ukrainian visual art is something that we'll be talking about today. We're very lucky to have Professor Miroslav Shkandriy, who's been our visiting professor in history here at the Ukrainian Studies program at the Harriman Institute for this semester, teaching two courses and taking part in our academic life here. And today he will be speaking on a topic, one of the topics that he is an expert on. Like I mentioned, Wellsprings of David Bolyuk's Art, Exploring His Enduring Inspiration from Kakhovka to New York. And we'll have a chance after the presentation to field questions both online and in person. I will just say that Miroslav Shkandriy is Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba, where he taught Slavic studies. He has published books on Ukraine in the 1920s, on Ukrainian-Russian relations, nationalism, avant-garde art, and contested views of revolutionary events. He's also curated a number of exhibitions dealing with the early 20th century avant-garde and has translated several Ukrainian authors into English. And as I mentioned, in fall 2021, he's a visiting professor in history, Ukrainian studies program at the Harriman Institute, Columbia University. So, Professor Shkandriy, I invite you.
Thank you for the introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to show some slides, and I will take off my mask, which is allowed at Columbia University for the professor to take off their mask as long as they're distanced from the students and the listeners. So David Bolyuk is a figure who created a major movement, a very important movement. He's known as the father of futurism in the Russian Empire, but there's a puzzle around him. How do we explain the rest of his career? How do we explain the style changes, the way that he moved from one style or one way of painting to another? We know some things about him very well. We know his early biography fairly well. Born in 1882 near Kharkiv, created this movement. He was right at the beginning of it. Some scholars have said without him, there would not have been futurism in the Russian Empire. Futurism, a movement that ruptured from previous academic styles, aimed to shock the public. He studied formally at different schools, Odessa, Kazan, Munich, Moscow, but he never really fitted in with the styles that were being taught. But all through his early life, he was in Ukraine, moving from place to place because his father managed estates. And the most famous one is the Chernyanka estate near Kherson in the south. That's where he first pulled together his Hylia group, the first futurist group. That's where his early publications, the first futurist publications came from in Kakhovka and other places close by. With Mayakovsky and with Kamensky, he toured this famous, notorious tour of 17 cities of the empire, in which they shocked the public with these performances. Really, they were designed to offend the audience. They would drink tea on stage under a hanging grand piano and then flick the tea dregs at the audience. Burlyuk loved the interaction with the public, the booing, the catcalling, and the performing with the face painted, the colorful waistcoat, and the whole thing that the futurists are famous for. But then he explored different styles. Besides Cubofuturism, Impressionism was one of his styles, abstract art in the 1920s in the United States, radio art, surrealism, and others. So we have this question: what was the enduring inspiration? What was constant about his career? We know, for example, that his passion for life, his boundless energy, his need for self-expression, all these things we can agree on. But what about his evolution as a whole? How do we view it? How can we understand it? Well, it began with neo-primitivism. He and his brother would dig up the burial mounds of Scythians in the south, in the southern Ukraine, in the steppes. They created an enormous museum full of these artifacts that they pulled out of the mounds, including skeletons and the stone ancient monuments. And Burlyuk was fascinated by this. He would actually take the images and the idea of a circular plate, which you can view from different sides, which he found in these Scythian artifacts, and he would put these into his art, including the first scandalous book that the futurists produced, The Trap for Judges, Sadok Sudey, which these are from. In 1912, he participated in the famous Blue Reiter exhibition in Munich. This was his marriage proposal from this time. So he embraced Cubism and the idea of the imagery of people kind of blending with the background. The background contends with the images. It's all on the surface. It's all part of the same structure. He explored Cubist designs and Cubist ideas in these kinds of artworks that we have. The Bricklayer from 1912, this three-headed man, roughly from 1912. And then he went into movement. He was very interested in movement. So neomorphism, how images in a kind of cinema style cadre can be used in art. This one is called Waves. Now I have to also say that many of these early works were actually repainted later, because when he came to New York, he signed a contract in which the dealer was able to take much of his early work. He was infuriated by this because he didn't read the small print carefully. And so he repainted for himself many of the works, and he put the original date on them. So sometimes we're not sure what was the original date, and we're not sure even whether the work was from the earlier period or a repainted one. So we get this with works like Dance. We get this with works like Florida, which he claimed he put the date 1910 on it, and also 1952. We're not sure which is which, what the original might have looked like. This was 1952. But then Bourdieu moved from 1918 to 1920. He traveled through Siberia a couple of times. Each place that he stopped at, he would show his works. He would organize a concert, a poetry reading, a lecture, display his works. He was a bit of a busker, so on the streets, he would invite people in. In order to make money, he would also do portraits. And his portraits are very good, very successful. So he adopted a kind of a more realistic style, because that's what sold. That's what people wanted to buy. This is a self-portrait from 1920. He caught typhoid while in Siberia. He traveled twice, I think, across the railway, the entire distance. And he did landscapes. They too sold. So you can see that he adopted different styles and actually was very successful, very good at all of them. Finally, when in Vladivostok, he had made enough money to bring out his wife and moved to Japan. Now, Bourdieu was not a stranger to the Bolsheviks. His brother had been killed by the Bolsheviks in Moscow because he had been in the Tsarist navy. And Bourdieu also was no proletarian. He was of essentially a bourgeois background. And he was aware of the difficulties that the futurists, people like him, were facing. He also knew that on the railway, he was warned that there would be an inspection of hands at the next station. This was a regular event. That meant that people were taken off the train, told to show their hands. And if their hands were not calloused, in other words, if they were not workers, they would sometimes be arrested or even executed as bourgeois. Bourdieu was wise to this. He was aware of this. So he made an effort to leave. And the next 2 years, 21 to 22, he was in Japan. Here he continued these kind of Cubo-futurist works. Again, movement he was very interested in movement. So you see these kind of vibrating figures. But also, and this is a famous one showing movement in a train, but also portraits. And this portrait of Viktor Palmov is a homage or homage to Palmov, who was a colorist who soon afterwards returned to Kiev, went to Kiev, and actually created a school of colorist art in Kiev. So we have a cubist, painter, a portraitist, a landscape painter, an experimenter. This is his wife, Marussia, whom he painted in Japan, 1922, and continued to paint. There are many, many paintings of Marussia. This is a Japanese woman from 1921. And these are the paintings that sold. So in Japan, he did a lot of these impressionist-like landscapes, and they were very successful. Even members of the aristocracy bought them. And he was actually asked to stay, to become a sort of a court painter. But he wanted to move on. Once he made enough money through selling these works, he moved to the United States. By then he had 2 small children and took his entire family with him. Always the salesman, he would do programs of his exhibitions, and each of the programs he would decorate with an individual little graphic and hand these out. So he was very good at self-promotion. He moved to Brooklyn, lived in a rather unspectacular area of Brooklyn. It wasn't very well off, wasn't rich at all. But he immediately made an effort to develop a reputation in the United States. So at one point he put on his colorful waistcoat, his top hat, his futurist outfit, painted face, and he walked pretty much all the way to Manhattan in order to stand on the street and invite people in to an exhibition that he had organized. Always declaring himself a great painter, a great futurist painter, the founder of futurism, and so on. He met his friend Mayakovsky when Mayakovsky came to the United States, and here he is sketching Mayakovsky on the beach, Brighton Beach. And then in 25, 26, he developed the radio style. Now, this was a style in which he sensed movement, radio waves he thought you could see, or the vibrations in the air you could see. So he sort of developed this style, a new style for a new civilization, for a dynamic new world. Here's Dickman Ferry from 1925. The idea was that buildings had energy, land had energy, and you could extend the lines into space. If you looked carefully enough, he would tell people, you can see these lines, you can see these radio waves. So in his manifesto from 1926, he talked about an age of cosmopolitanism. He talked about the power of the telescope. He insisted that people have more than 5 senses, and in future, people will be able to develop further senses, new senses. An age of kinetic and dynamic energy is coming. And he also suggested that people have to develop what he called slow sight, the ability to see an action in its different evolving frames. So the radio style was supposed to be his contribution to the new American art. But he also then moved into surrealism, this mysterious world where there's suggestions of strange and occult happenings. Sometimes the strangeness is this erotic mystery. And here you have Welcome Island, in which sailors leave the ship and are welcomed by semi-naked ladies with colorful umbrellas, horses. So the suggestion of an erotic imagination, also surrealistic. And then this idea of a mysterious nature whose powers have to be understood and unlocked. All these instruments are about unlocking, measuring, understanding. This is called the kiss of the mountain. So you have this sense of penetrating the mysteries of nature, something that Bourdieu always was very fascinated by. It's a little bit Dali-esque, a little bit surrealistic. But then the war came, and during the war, the leftist milieu in which he moved, usually Jewish and Russian and Ukrainian emigres, put on exhibitions to raise money for the war effort. And this generated a new kind of style, a political style. So this is called Children of Stalingrad. On the left, you see the destruction of the war. And then in the middle, you see Marussia, his wife, and his children and grandchildren. And then you see the New World on the right. And in the window, you see almost a vision of a future paradise, a future peaceful, sunlit existence. So this was his part of his contribution to that, the exhibitions that raised money for the war effort and for post-war reconstruction. He also did a couple of versions of this Lenin and Tolstoy painting at the time. In the distance, you see New York, and Lenin is plowing what appears to be New Jersey. Tolstoy is at the front. So Bourdieu's explanation was that Tolstoy represented the old world, Lenin represented the new. On Lenin is the sun, and on Tolstoy, on his clothing is the moon. So the moon is in decline, in eclipse, the sun is coming forward. And this is maybe a gesture towards his leftist milieu. But in fact, Bourdieu was very, very cautious about the Soviet Union and very circumspect about how to deal with people from the embassy, from the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy, and how to deal with the Soviet representatives. In fact, he was much closer to the Tolstoyan view of things. The earth, he adored Tolstoy. He admired him greatly. He read him, and he kept quoting Tolstoy. So one has to be aware of that. After the war, he developed a fascination with Van Gogh, traveled to Arles and lived there for a while and did paintings in the style of Van Gogh and explored a sort of local dimension, the way people lived locally. This is also from France, from Van Gogh's, the village where Van Gogh stayed. And when he came back, he continued this kind of ethnographic, naive realism, if you want to call it that. This is a painting from the East Coast of the United States. It's very heavily impastoed. The paint on it is like an inch thick. He just used the tubes and he just squeezed out all the paint he could. And this is important because Bourdieu lost an eye as a small child. He looked into a a cannon, a toy cannon, and the cannonball fired and knocked out his eye. So all his life he had one eye. So texture was very important to him. He would look very closely at the earth, at objects. He would study them through a microscope, very close up. And he was very much aware of the texture of painting. He actually wrote a lot about texture in painting. The different kinds of texture, the sandy, the smooth, the spiky, all this was very important to him. And the earth, the idea of mixing earth with paint also was important to him. So some of his early paintings were he actually threw them into the mud, mixed the mud of the Kherson landscape with the paintings, and then used them. He continued with this kind of ethnographic style all the way through from the 40s to the 60s. This is Your Fortune Told, and he placed them in New York on a certain avenue and street. And this is his sort of homage to the common people, the common life in New York. This is another one on the beach. And this is in Florida. Drink milk. These were very popular, and they sold. Bourliuk presented himself to different groups in different ways. He was a survivor, and he was a clever kind of a person who could mix and get by with different people. So his careful stance towards the Soviet Union was rewarded. He was allowed to visit a couple of times. He was in Crimea in 1956. This is his painting of Bakhchisarai. And then again, he was invited towards the end of his life to Moscow in 65, where he visited, enjoyed himself, went with his wife. Towards the end of his life, he did a lot of traveling and was in fact in the Soviet Union a couple of times. But as I said, he was no fool when it came to understanding the politics. His friend Mayakovsky, this is a graphic of his friend, committed suicide in 1930. And this is what Bourliuk painted at that time. It shows Mayakovsky lost, looking in different directions and sort of pinned to the ground. Now, I interpret this as being a critique, a criticism of what happened to Mayakovsky. A person who was lost, a talent that was lost, that was wasted, and that the Soviet Union had crushed. Later in life, he lived on Long Island, Hampton Bays area. And he built a house there, a garage. It's still visible today. You can see it. He turned to nature, to family history, to nostalgia for the land that he had left, Ukraine, the southern part of Ukraine. And in the final part of his existence, he went through a coda. He repeated, summarized all these styles, all these forms. Actually, he even today, this garage that he built has this enormous fresco inside. It actually fills the entire interior of the garage. It will never be viewed because there's no way you can take the garage out. And the only way you can see it is by going in and sort of walking down the wall and seeing it. The whole house is full of paintings. He produced, over his lifetime, 17,000 works estimated, maybe more. So our job is to sort of figure out what happened, how he moved from style to style. final part of his life, a lot of still lifes. There's wonderful paintings of flowers, of lilacs, these really quite marvelous compositions. It was sometimes a little bit impressionistic, but also very charming, very well done. But he also, all his life, was quite aware of the fact that he was Ukrainian. So Cossack Mamai was a painting that he kept coming back to. And the Cossack Mamai, an 18th century folk symbol, represents, self-sufficiency, rugged individualism, a person, with their own horse, their food, a frontiersman who's also a charismatic figure. This is how he saw himself. In fact, the family came from Zaporozhian Cossacks. He was very much aware of that. And in a family tree that was painted, they have a Zaporozhian in the south, and the branch of the family spans out in different directions. Bourdieu was very much aware of this family origin. He also fashioned earrings in the Zaporozhian manner. The Zaporozhians, the Cossacks, would wear one earring only. And he made his own, and he worked around with the one earring. The family legend has it that in the famous Repin painting of the Zaporozhians writing a letter to the Sultan of Turkey, the semi-naked immense figure at whose back you see was the father of Bourdieu. So Bourdieu's father, as it were, posed for that Repin painting. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's the family legend. That's something that was repeated. Here he is in New York, and you can already see, those are his two sons who are growing up. So this is probably the 30s. You can see on the wall these paintings, these nostalgic paintings of his childhood, his youth in Ukraine, the steppe, the horses, the farms, the windmills, the girls, all these he kept coming back to. And he would design even these dolls for the family. These are the famous paintings that he's often known for. They're very vivid, they're very colorful. They have a unique quality. And they have often been admired. So Henry Miller, when he saw these, he wrote a letter to Bourdieu saying that he'd often stood in front of these intensely colorful scenes and marveled at the vividness and the power of these depictions. But there were also sad points in his life, and he did these gnome-like figures. He's an older couple in Trenton from 56. They are challenged by these much more radiant, much happier pictures that he is that really made him an outstanding figure in contemporary 20th century contemporary art. Here are the two girls. Very common for him was to depict his childhood loves, his childhood attractions, and this image of Ukraine from his early years. So, how do we summarize? Well, Bourdieu, towards the end of his life, he found it hard to hold a paintbrush. He was losing strength. So what he would do is he would paint on little wood blocks, and he would sort of hover over them and do these paints. And they're absolutely amazing. The amount of detail, the characters that he was able to present the personalities on these tiny wooden blocks are quite amazing. This is from a display in Winnipeg, where we organized the display of Bourliuk, and you can see they're very, very small, but they are extremely interesting and extremely expressive. The other interesting thing about these blocks is, and there are hundreds of them, they're like massive chests full of these that he did. The other interesting thing is that they summarize his styles. It's like a coda. He goes back to futurism. He goes through all the styles and he kind of recalled everything that had been through everything he had experimented with. So my conclusion would be that he is not just a rule breaker, not just a person who challenged accepted taste, but also a person who really explored organic form, materials, processes. He was fascinated by the powers of nature and the ability to get close up to nature, to really sort of look into it through almost a microscopic lens. He also believed in the power of intuition, a mystical understanding of nature, and a sense of cosmic vibrations. You get this in the movement images, but you also get it in the impressionistic paintings of landscapes, where it's almost as though in high summer, everything is buzzing, everything is moving, everything in nature is a myriad of small forms. He loved those pictures, and that seemed to be like a mystical understanding of what was happening in the earth. So his earth-inspired works differ from what sometimes some futurists painted. A lot of futurism was inspired by technology, glorified machine. I think Bourliuk worshipped nature rather than the dominance of the machine. And this was an enduring aspect of his work. As I said, he was no proletarian. We have evidence from his own statements, his brother's murder, the hand inspections I mentioned, and his admiration for Tolstoy rather than Lenin. But he was crafty, and he was able to maneuver through different groups, societies, milieus. He was also inspired by the idea of the past in the present. So if you look at the evidence of the family tree, this idea of the father being a model for Repin's painting. If you look in the Syracuse Museum, into his archive, you see the paintings and the depictions of Sahaidachny, the famous Cossack from Ukraine, the Cossack Mamai. In the memoirs of his son, the son mentions that as a young man, Bourliuk would listen to bandura players in the steppe. He would listen to these wandering minstrels with the songs that they presented. These are usually epics, songs from the past. He read Yuri Kosach. He actually asked for the works so that he could read them. And this was an author who wrote about the Cossack past. And he self-identified as a Ukrainian. So when Professor Miyakovsky and his daughter went to visit him, they were welcomed by his wife, who immediately said, "Oh, my husband will be delighted to see you because he's also Ukrainian." So they sat down, they talked, and apparently I was told that they taped the conversation. And he spoke perfect Ukrainian. So somewhere in Uvan, in the Ukrainian Free Academy of Sciences, there is a tape of Bourliuk speaking Ukrainian. So I think the self-identity, the the awareness of the past in the present is part of his enduring inspiration. I would argue that he was inspired by this early contact with nature in Ukraine, something that he kept returning to, the still lifes, the flowers, the memories of girls, windmills, horses, the steppe, all appreciated by the audience, but something that inspired him. And maybe finally one would have to say that he sort of wanted to open the doors of perception through experimentation to discover the hidden mechanisms of the universe. He even painted the interior of the atom at one point, this idea that you can get really close into nature and understand how it functions. He was looking for connections, parallels, patterns. So I think we need to reassess Bourdieu and look at his entire career and find ways of explaining what was constant, what was enduring, as well as what he achieved early in his life. He wasn't just the founder of futurism in the Russian Empire, he was also the founder of futurism in Japan. He was also an American painter, a member of the emigre East European set in New York, and he was also a sort of a passionate fan of southern Ukraine. So that's my presentation.
Thank you very much. The fascinating talk on Bourdieu, and thank you for touching on the New York aspects, of his life. That was quite fascinating. And there's a lot of points that we can discuss now, and we're opening up the floor to questions at this point. I will begin with a question of my own, kind of going back to what you started with, but also continuing this point that you made in your conclusions. So going back to the futurist period, but also looking at, in his reminiscence, Bourdieu writes, he writes primarily in Russian, but he says, I could be writing this in Ukrainian. And you mentioned the recording at Uvan, which I didn't know about. That's fascinating too. So we knew he knew how to write in Ukrainian. So my question is, in working as, the father of futurism, basically, and the way that a lot of futurist poetry, whether visual or not, would incorporate, it had a kind of international feel to it, right? It had several languages could be presented at once. We've seen that in a lot of the works. I'm curious, because I'm really not aware, that Ukrainian never show up in any of those, in his, whether in his futurist books, in those early works. Did the knowledge of the Ukrainian language appear in these artistic works? And also, what was his relationship, if any, with Ukrainian futurists at this time? Was there contact between Bourdieu and Semenko and Bajan, Shkurupi at all? So if you would comment on that.
Should I get up there?
I think so, yes. But we'd have to be, yeah.
Well, he left before the Ukrainian futurism took off. I mean, he was already gone
Right.
in 1918. So the contacts was not there. But the milieu that he moved in did include some Ukrainians. There's not much Ukrainian in the Russian language works. Bourdieu at one point, you're right, Bourdieu at one point said, I should be writing this in Ukrainian. But my interpretation of that was that I have some difficulty in writing it in Ukrainian. I feel more comfortable in Russian. He worked in Russian. So I don't think there's a lot in Ukrainian.
Mhm.
But there is a sensibility that is Ukrainian, definitely. And even the people that he hung out with, Khlebnikov, Khrushchevnik, and the others, Mayakovsky, he actually, to some degree, Ukrainianized them. They began writing about Ukraine in an entirely different, more positive way, and in fact, spoke about Ukraine, the Cossacks, the South as being this sort of powerhouse of energy. These people who are dynamic and who generate, they're the turbines generating power in the South. So there's sort of these are genuflections towards Burlyuk and towards the Ukrainianness. And if you read, there's a very fascinating description by Lifshitz of this early period, and he talks about Burlyuk as being, clearly he was the Ukrainian in the group, and these people were fascinated by him. They admired him for so not only being such a dynamic personality, but for bringing sort of this Ukrainian spirit into futurism.
Mhm. Well, thank you. And that's I realized, yeah, that with the language choice, that's why he probably wrote. But that's why I figure maybe in the future that's where you can just throw in one word, right? A lot of these languages they were employed.
There's a little bit of that.
Yeah.
There is a bit of that.
That's fascinating. Okay, we can open up the floor to questions. Yes, Ambassador Polinsky.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. It was a fascinating presentation. I was taking interest in Burlyuk's works at various periods. So I want to ask you several questions very briefly. First of all, how would you assess the public interest in Burlyuk's works, US, international? And could you say that there were perhaps some waves of interest getting more intense and then going down and then again? So if you noticed it, if it really is the case, could you explain it if it exists? Number two, where do you think, where do you know his output, his creative output is held? Mostly in private collections, or you mentioned the Syracuse Museum, any other museums that you know of that have, because I have not seen this in many famous museums. And another thing that is also there, definitely, as many Ukrainian geniuses and artists, painters, artistic personalities, they're still branded Russian. Not to go far away, there's a Russian arts auction in Moscow starting tomorrow. A huge one. And they have some maybe up to 1 dozen works by Burlyuk, and definitely he is Russian. Although he felt himself as Ukrainian. So this is another thing, if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Well, yeah, Burlyuk fell into some neglect at different points in his life. He became an American painter, and with that aspect of his life is not well known in Russia or Ukraine. So when people write about Burlyuk, in the East, in Ukraine and Russia, they write about what they have, what they know. They don't know anything, or they have very little information and few works from his North American period. So there's a disjointedness. And the other thing is that he is known as the founder of futurism. That's become a stamp, a brand. And people often don't go beyond that. Not only that, but he's known as a futurist in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And people don't go beyond that very often. So there's a slantedness to the presentation of his works. I think that he's been a puzzle to many people who can't put there's no attempt, not been an attempt to put the pieces together of the puzzle. So, and he has been, I think, neglected partly because of that. But he is due for a revival of interest. He's a fascinating character, a dynamic personality, and these aspects of his contribution to art in different continents and different places, I think, need to be rediscovered. So I think he is due for a reassessment. This leads to the second question. Part of the reassessment will depend on the availability of works. Some of his works are in different universities. Universities bought them or were offered them. They're in private collections. The largest amount of his works are owned by Mary Holt Burluc, who is his granddaughter. I think she owns about half his collection. She inherited the house on Long Island. And those works exist, but they're not often shown. In fact, the exhibitions that were mounted in Canada and then here fairly recently were the first time that these works have been presented to the public. So there are a lot of works that need researching and showing and displaying. They are available, but they're not, they're in private collections, basically. And I think as with other artists from Ukraine or from the Russian Empire, the Ukrainian aspect of their lives, the Ukrainian inspiration, if you want to put it that way, of their lives, is often not foregrounded, especially if the critic, the art critic or the art historian, is writing from Moscow or from St. Petersburg. There's just less interest in that and less knowledge of it. So it's just a sort of a gap in the awareness. That goes for Malevich too. It goes for Exter, it goes for Tatlin, it goes for all sorts of individuals whose works actually are hanging in the MoMA, but are labeled Russian artist. Now, to be fair, you could say, yes, he was a Russian artist, a Ukrainian artist, an American artist, because he belonged to different schools, he painted in different places, and he can be claimed by different schools. In the same way as Jewish artists from Kiev could be claimed, could be described as Ukrainian artists, Jewish artists, Russian artists, Central European artists, German artists if they move to Germany. That's fair. But
to an extent.
Well, it is to an extent, yeah. I mean, you can be part of different schools, but not to acknowledge that a person is of Ukrainian background and stated that they felt they were inspired by Ukraine. I mean, that's a little bit unfair. So I think it's a blindness, a blind spot in in the critical appreciation of many artists.
Thank you very much.
kind of piggybacking on the second question about availability, Ron Meyer is asking, you mentioned his house on Long Island, the fresco in the garage. Is this open to the public? And has the house been made into a museum?
No, answer is no. I stumbled into the garage totally by accident. Because Mary Holt said, oh, by the way, he built the garage. Go take a look. So I went down it, and there's this enormous thing. It was like wall, the entire wall is just this thing. I couldn't photograph it because there's no way you can, actually get it on a photograph. It's just not possible to stand back from it and photograph it. Not only that, but when I was there anyway, there are stacks of watercolors. This is probably the wrong word, but I think Baruch had attention deficit disorder. I think he just constantly needed to work. I mean, he just needed to paint. He needed to be sculpting and chiseling. And the whole house is full of stuff that he did, including the walls. I should also say that he published a journal called Color and Rhyme, in which he, republished his works, his poetry, English translations of it, and he sold this. But many of the issues could not be sold. So he used them to insulate the walls of this house in Long Island. And I think they're still in the walls. I don't know what's going to happen to that house. It's an amazing place. It's carved, it's painted, it's all done by Baruch. It's a work, one of his works. Whether it will be a museum, I doubt it, because it is being sold. There is a move to sell it. So it may actually become something completely different or disappear. But it is, in its own way, it's part of his legacy.
Depending who the buyer.
Yes, yes, yeah. But real estate agents are often not very concerned with preserving artistic, unless there's a financial incentive to do so.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more question. And it's kind of a long one. You've answered many of these points, but I'll read it. And I think the last part is something that has of interest. Was Baruch a Ukrainianist? How did he relate to other people of the area, i.e. to Greeks, Poles, Russophones? Did he depict the ethnic richness of Ukrainian in his paintings? How about religion? Did religion, a very integral part of Ukrainian life, psyche, and culture, find its way on his canvas and woodblocks? Any examples that you could show us?
I don't think the religious part did. That was not part of his inspiration. And I don't see any evidence of that. He was a rule breaker at the beginning of his life. I think that was, he was more sort of interested in a pagan appreciation of the world. A connection to more distant history, including the Scythians and the ancient past. I don't think the church, there was no ecclesiastical sort of interest on his part. The people that he painted, though, were common people. He loved this idea of common people chatting, sitting around a table, eating, interacting. That was a big part of his inspiration. And these scenes repeat in Ukraine, in North America. It's sort of the community. So you get the sense of different types, different kinds of people, but there's no specific interest in different races. Occasionally you do get colored people depicted, but it's not that wasn't part of what he was interested in specifically. It wasn't something that was driving his creativity. I think that was there another aspect to that question?
No, I think and ethnic richness of Ukraine in his paintings, I think you've addressed that. Yes.
Yeah, probably that. You know, he also was a little bit of a explorer of no, the culture around him. So he would deliberately go out to try and meet odd people, see strange phenomena. In his son's memoir, unpublished memoir, his son mentions that when his father learned of a haunted house somewhere near Kherson, right, he would ask if he could spend the night in the haunted house. So he would kind of wander around looking for strange experiences, meeting people, chatting with them. You know, that would be the extent of his interest in different kinds of people. But he didn't identify specific, you know, nationalities or races or anything like that.
All right, well, we're over time now, so we're gonna wrap it up at this point. Again, thank you, Miroslav. Wonderful talk. A lot of new ideas to explore and maybe eventually see the museum garage in Long Island. So thanks for that information as well, and for opening up various aspects of a very fascinating creative individual. Thank you.
Pleasure.